Get on your knees. My lady,
The command
clean the
echoed
floor,
through the
now.
grand Jubilee Gala as hundreds of nobles turned to watch. Lady Zyrel Wincrest stood in the center of the ballroom, holding a crystal goblet filled with red
look at
wine.
her, a servant pretending she belongs among nobles.
She should be grateful she works here.
She's nothing more than a maid.
"Clean it," she ordered.
There, clean every drop. She's treating her like dirt. Nobody dares challenge Lady Zyrel.
The young maid lowered her head. The crowd laughed. Some nobles looked away in discomfort. Others watched with amusement. Slowly, Valora dropped to her knees. Her hands trembled as she reached for a cloth. Then suddenly, crash!
What
A wine
happened?
glass shattered
Stop playing!
across the ballroom.
Who interrupted
The
my
music
gala?
stopped. Every head turned. Dowager Queen Thalassa was standing. Her eyes were locked on the maid. Her face had gone completely pale. "Impossible,"
How did
she
you get
whispered.
this?
The
What do you
entire
mean?
hall fell
That
silent,
mark on your chest, it
because
cannot
beneath the
be. I don't
maid's
know what you're talking
collarbone
about.
was a
Your
black
Majesty.
scar,
Your
a scar the
Majesty.
Queen Mother had not
Scar?
seen in
What
20
is she
years.
talking about?
A scar belonging to only one person, the lost heiress of Oralith, and the people humiliating her were the very people who had stolen her kingdom. But before we uncover how a missing princess became a palace maid, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to bring you more powerful stories like this one. If you enjoy stories filled with betrayal, shocking secrets, and unforgettable justice, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Now let's go back to where it all began. Valora was 6 years old the first time she pressed her palm against the cold stone of the palace window and watched the kingdom breathe. Oralith stretched below her like something dreamed rather than built. Terraced gardens where amber roses climbed iron trellises, marble fountains catching the afternoon light, and beyond the palace walls, the city's copper-tiled rooftops shimmering in summer heat. She could smell bread baking in the lower quarters, thick and yeasty, drifting up even to the high floors where the royal family lived. Her mother, Queen Lysara, had told her once that a kingdom smells like its people. Oralith smelled like warm grain and river water and cedar smoke. King Aerion was a quiet man, broad-shouldered and deliberate, the kind of king who read every petition himself before signing anything. Lysara was the one who laughed loud enough to fill a hall, who remembered the names of kitchen workers and stable hands, who once sent 3 wagons of salted fish to a flooded village because she had heard about it in passing and could not let the thought go. They died in the same week, a fever that moved through the palace with quiet cruelty. The royal physician spent 4 days in their chambers. On the 5th day, he came out without his bag. Valora was told they were resting. She believed it for 3 more days because no one had the courage to tell a 6-year-old anything different. Her uncle Corvian arrived on the 8th day. He was her father's younger brother, narrow where Aerion had been broad, quick-eyed where Aerion had been steady. He wore grief on his face the way men wear borrowed clothes, correctly fitted but unconvincing. He walked the palace halls with his hands clasped behind his back, pausing in doorways, measuring rooms with his eyes. He summoned a woman named Odrina Voss on the 12th day. Valora never saw her clearly, only a figure in a grey travelling cloak crossing the courtyard at dusk, carrying a bag that clinked faintly as she walked. Whatever passed between them in the eastern corridor took less than 10 minutes. That night, Valora was woken by a woman she did not recognize. She was told to put on her warmest dress. She was not told why. She left Aurelith in the back of a wool merchant's cart, buried under bolts
Far
of
away.
undyed fabric that scratched her face and smelled of lanolin and damp. By morning, the city was gone. Odrina Voss left her at the door of a widow in a farming settlement 3 provinces west, handed over a modest
for your
sum of
keep.
coin,
Where
and
is he
rode
going?
back without a word of
That's not for you to
explanation.
know.
The widow was not cruel. She was simply poor and indifferent in the way that poverty makes people indifferent. There was food, a pallet near the hearth, and work. Valora learned to carry water from the well before she was 7. She learned to mend before she was 8. She stopped asking questions about where she came from because asking produced only silence. But the feeling never left. It sat in her chest like a stone placed there by someone else's hand, a persistent pressure that sharpened whenever she smelled cedar smoke or heard a horse pass on the road or saw amber roses growing wild along a fence. She asked the widow about it once, standing at the hearth stirring a thin barley soup while the wind pressed hard against the shutters. "Why does it feel like I belong somewhere else?" The widow did not look up from her mending. Lots of people feel that way. It doesn't mean anything. But it did. 3 provinces away, in a palace that still carried the faint scent of Lysara's perfume and Aryan cedar oil, Corvian sat at the head of the council table and listened to men address him as regent. He had not merely stolen from the royal treasury, though he had done that too. He had stolen the ground beneath an entire kingdom's feet, their lawful queen, their future, 200 years of unbroken bloodline, for the price of a wool merchant's silence and 1 woman in a grey cloak. Valora was stirring barley soup in a stranger's house. She did not yet know what had been taken from her. Valora was 19 when she walked through the servants' gate of the Aurelith Palace for the first time since she was 6, and she did not recognize a single stone of it. She had come because there was nothing left in the farming settlement. The widow had died the previous winter, the land was sold to cover debts, and the only work Valora had been able to find in the surrounding villages paid barely enough to cover a meal. Someone at the market in Korith had mentioned that the palace in Aurelith was taking on household staff. She had walked for 2 days to get there, her belongings wrapped in a canvas cloth and slung over one shoulder, her boots worn thin at the left heel. The steward who processed her name into the ledger did not look at her face. He asked whether she could scrub, carry, and follow instruction without complaint. She said she could. He assigned her to the interior cleaning rotation and pointed her toward the servants' quarters, a long, low-ceilinged corridor behind the east kitchen that smelled of lye soap and boiled turnip.
You get used to it.
The palace was larger than anything she had words for. High vaulted ceilings painted in deep blue and gold, corridors that branched and folded back on themselves, windows dressed in heavy curtains the color of old wine. The kitchen alone was the size of 3 houses stacked together, copper pots hanging from iron hooks, a hearth wide enough to roast an ox whole, clay jars of preserved plum and dried herbs lining every shelf from floor to ceiling. On her first morning, a cook pressed a bowl of warm, spiced porridge into her hands without being asked, and Valora stood in the enormous kitchen and ate it slowly, watching the controlled chaos around her with something she could not quite name. She worked hard. That was simply her nature, the one thing the farming years had built into her so completely it required no thought. She scrubbed flagstone floors on her knees without complaint. She carried linens up 4 flights of stairs without being reminded. She learned the room rotations quickly, remembered which corridors were used by the family and which were safe for staff, and never left a surface half finished. The other servants
Take my
warmed
better
to her
brush.
without
I
ceremony.
couldn't.
Petra from the laundry, who saved her the better scrubbing brush. Old Emil, the lamp tender, who showed her which wicks needed replacing before they were asked. The girl Sovie, who always saved a bread roll from supper if Velora was working late. It was the quiet currency of people who lived by the work of their hands, and Velora understood it instinctively. Zyriel and Mylise were a different matter. They were senior household maids, both of them installed long enough to consider the corridors a kind of territory. They did not dislike Velora for any reason she could identify. There was no incident, no confrontation. It was something colder than that. The way Zyriel's eyes moved over her when she entered a room, the way Mylise redirected assignments so that Velora was always given the longest routes and the coldest floors. Nothing that could be named directly, everything that could be felt. She said nothing about it. She was accustomed to silences that meant something other than they appeared to be. On the third week, she was assigned to the portrait corridor on the upper east wing, a long gallery where the former monarchs hung in gilded frames, their painted eyes tracking you as you moved. She worked methodically, lifting each frame slightly to dust behind it, wiping the glass with a cloth dampened in vinegar water. She reached a portrait near the end of the gallery and stopped. The man in the frame was broad-shouldered, steady-eyed, painted in formal robes of deep green with a gold chain across his chest. The small plate beneath the frame read, "King Arian, Sovereign of Oralith." She studied the painting for a moment with no particular feeling beyond a vague and unearned familiarity, the way a place you have never been can still feel half-remembered. Then she raised her cloth and cleaned the glass with the same careful attention she had given every portrait before it. She moved on without looking back. At the far end of the corridor, half concealed behind the frame of an open door, Dowager Queen Thalassa stood very still. She was a small woman, white-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades watching people more carefully than they knew they were being watched. She had stood beside Lysera for 22 years. She knew that posture. She said nothing. She retrieved her book and walked back the way she had come, her expression unchanged. But her hand, when it closed around the book's spine, held it slightly tighter than necessary.
Zarel's hostility sharpened with the way cold does in late autumn, gradually, and then all at once. It began with small things. A bucket of dirty water left directly in Velora's path in the kitchen stairs. Assignments quietly altered so that Velora arrived at rooms already claimed, then faced Zarel's flat stare when she tried to explain the mix-up to the steward. A cloth soaked in vinegar pressed into her hands for a task that required dry linen, so that she had to redo an hour's work from the beginning. None of it was provable. All of it was deliberate. Mylise followed Zarel's lead the way smaller fires follow a larger one, not with the same intensity, but reliably. She repeated things Zarel said. She laughed when Zarel laughed. She positioned herself always slightly behind, always just within earshot, a witness who could later claim to have seen nothing. The public moments were worse. It happened first in the lower dining hall, where the servants took their midday meal at a long oak table, scarred from years of use.
Clumsy fool,
Velora had set down her bowl, lentil broth with a heel of dark bread, the standard midday meal, and was reaching for the water pitcher when Zarel's elbow caught her arm. The broth went across the table. It soaked Velora's sleeve, pooled on the bench, dripped to the floor. The hall went briefly quiet. "Careful," Zarel said, not looking at her. "Some people are clumsy no matter how long they train." There was a beat of silence. Then Mylise laughed, and two others followed because the hall required a response, and laughter was the easiest one.
I'm sorry.
Velora said nothing. She collected what
Clumsy
remained
fool.
of the
Clean this
bread,
up.
cleaned
Yes,
the
my
bench
lady.
herself, and went back to work with a wet sleeve
Watch
that
yourself.
dried stiff by afternoon. The wine came 3 days later.
Clumsy fool.
Velora had been
Clean this
assigned
up
to
at
lay
once.
fresh
Right
linens in the upper guest corridor,
Hurry
and
up
she
and
was
clean
carrying an
every drop,
armful
you
of
clumsy
folded
girl.
cloth
Disturbance.
when Zarel appeared from a side
How
door with a
fitting.
tray she was ostensibly delivering. The tray tilted. The glass of red wine on it came down across Velora's chest, soaking through her uniform to her skin. It was cold, and it stung, and the smell of it stayed in the fabric no matter how thoroughly she scrubbed it that evening. Zarel looked at the stain and said in a mild performance, "It suits you, actually. Red was always a servant's color." Velora looked at her for one quiet second, then bent to retrieve the fallen linens from the floor. The servants who watched these moments did not do nothing, they simply could not do much. Emil, the lamp tender, began leaving a second bread roll near Velora's workstation in the evenings. Petra started timing her laundry rounds to overlap with Velora's corridor assignments, a quiet presence that changed the temperature of a room without requiring explanation. Sophie, who was 16 and still learning how power moved through a household, began watching Zarel with an attention she had not shown before. It was Petra who spoke one evening when Velora was wringing out a mop in the stone utility room behind the east kitchen, alone and unhurried about it, in the way of someone performing a task simply because it was in front of them. Petra leaned in the doorway, arms folded, and said, "You deserve better than this." Velora wrung the last of the water from the mop and set it against the wall. She considered the statement without apparent distress, the way she considered most things, directly and without softening it. "Some people are simply born to serve," she said. She meant it plainly. It was not self-pity, and it was not performance. It was the conclusion of a girl raised on thin barley soup and cold well water, who had never been given a single reason to believe the world had arranged itself with her in mind. Petra said nothing more. She pushed off the doorframe and walked back towards the laundry. Steward Rennick was not a man who sought trouble. He was methodical, discreet, and committed to the efficient running of a large household in the way that certain men commit themselves to a craft, completely and without much sentiment. He had been steward of Aurelith Palace for 11 years, and in 11 years he had never gone looking through the old administrative records stored in the lower archive room beneath the north staircase. He went looking now because a supply ledger from the current quarter had referenced a filing code that did not match anything in the current system, and Rennick could not leave an inconsistency unresolved. He found the relevant ledger. He also found, pressed flat between two accounting logs dated 18 years prior, a document that had no business being there, a sealed registry notation in the palace's formal hand, recording the removal of a minor child from Aurelith under instruction from the regent's office. The child was not named directly, but the date matched the week of King Erion's death, and the filing code on the document had been deliberately transposed, a small, careful error that would send anyone searching in the wrong direction. Rennick stood in the low light of the archive room for a long time, the document in both hands, reading it twice more to be certain he had understood it. Then he folded it carefully, placed it inside his coat, and went back upstairs without telling anyone what he had found.
The Winter Gala came on the longest night of the year. The grand ballroom was dressed fully, candelabras burning from every bracket, light catching gold-threaded drapes and throwing amber across white marble floors. Long tables ran the eastern wall, roasted pheasant on beds of herb-dressed grain, glazed parsnips in copper dishes, dark bread still steaming, and at the center, a tower of spiced pears soaked in wine reduction. The smell of warm fruit, melted beeswax, and cedar filled the room floor to ceiling. Velora had been assigned to floor service.
She moved between guests with a tray, efficient and unobtrusive. She was crossing the center of the floor with a tray of wine glasses when Zarel stepped directly into her path. Zarel spoke loudly enough for the surrounding circle to hear.
You've been dragging
your
I'm
feet
sorry,
all
my
evening.
lady.
She looked at
proper
Valora
servant
with
kneels.
deliberate contempt. A proper servant kneels when receiving correction. It was not a real rule. Everyone in the household knew it. But the ballroom had that social quality where the loudest statement becomes the temporary truth, and guests had already turned to watch. Valora lowered herself to one knee, tray balanced, expression giving nothing. The laughter that followed was not universal, but it was audible. From across the room, Thalassa watched, as she had been watching Valora at intervals for weeks. When the candlelight fell across Valora at that angle, Thalassa saw it clearly for the first time. A small black mark on the inside of Valora's left wrist, crescent-shaped. She set down her glass. Every child born to the Oralith royal line was marked at birth, ceremonial ink pressed
Your
into
Majesty.
the inner wrist, black and permanent.
Impossible.
A private tradition recorded only in the royal family registry. Thalassa had held Lysara's wrist herself the morning after Valora was born and watched it placed there. She crossed the ballroom floor and the crowd parted. She reached Valora, took her wrist gently but directly and turned it to the light. The mark was exact. The room went quiet in a spreading wave, the way water stills from a center point outward. Audrina Voss was located within 4 days, living under a changed name in a coastal trading town, running a small dyeing business. When palace guards arrived, she did not run.
Audrina
She
Voss?
sat at her workroom
I've been
table,
expecting you.
hands flat on the surface,
You must come with
the
us.
face of a woman who had been waiting 19 years for a knock at the door. Her confession was complete. She named Corvian, described the corridor meeting, the merchant's cart, the widow's door. From a locked tin box beneath her floor, she produced the original written instruction in Corvian's hand, authorizing the child's removal.
I found you.
When Thalassa entered the
don't
room where
understand.
Valora waited,
You
Valora
will.
stood at the window with her arms crossed, not from cold, but from the posture of someone bracing against something they cannot name. Thalassa cast the room, took Valora's face in both hands, and looked at her the way a person looks at something lost past the point of finding. Then she pulled her close and held her. Valora did not yet understand the full weight of it. She understood only that this woman's grief and relief were 20 years deep, and that the stone in her chest, that persistent, wordless pressure, was shifting for the first time in her life. She broke first, Thalassa followed. Corvian's eldest son moved that same night. He arrived at the archive room with 2 men and a lamp, intending to destroy the records before they could be catalogued.
Nothing must remain.
The shelves were exactly
Burn it
as
all!
expected. Rennick was not there.
Burn it faster.
He had been there
Leave
3
nothing.
hours earlier. The documents
Shelves
were
are going
already
up.
copied and placed with
Everything
3
is
separate
guilty
people
as
in
fun.
3
Where are the
separate
documents?
locations, none of
They're
whom
gone.
knew about the others. Corvian's son stood in the empty room with nothing to destroy and understood he was already too late. The royal hearing
evidence
was
is
held
prepared.
in the Hall of Consideration, a severe room of bare stone walls, a long council table, and narrow windows letting in grey winter light without warmth. Rennick presented the copied documents one at a time, explaining each in measured tones. The registry notation, the authorization in Corvian's hand, the deliberately transposed filing code, and what it had been designed to conceal. Audrina Voss testified standing, as she had requested, for 20 minutes without wavering. The courtyard crossing, the corridor meeting,
remove
the
the
merchant's cart, the child in her warmest dress asking no questions because no one had prepared her with anything to ask.
3 palace staff from the period of Arian's death each contributed something small they had witnessed without understanding. Together the pieces formed a complete picture. Corvian spoke at length and with skill. The council listened without expression. When he finished, the lead councillor looked at him once, then looked away, which was its own verdict.
You cannot prove.
Zirel's household position was revoked immediately. Melis was reassigned to a provincial estate 3 days' ride from the capital. Neither was given opportunity to respond. They were simply informed, and the matter moved past them. Corvian was removed from the regency and escorted from the hall through a side door. The room watched him go in silence. Thealora's formal restoration as heir took less than 12 minutes. She sat to the right of the council table, hands in her lap, back straight. When the declaration was read aloud, she nodded once. Several months passed. The winter gala returned, and the grand ballroom was dressed again. Candelabras, cedar, the smell of roasting meat from kitchen fires burning since morning, the same copper dishes, the same marble floor polished back to brightness, the same nobility filling the room in the same configurations of rank and alliance. The doors at the far end opened. Thealora entered alone, which had been her preference. She wore deep green, the sovereign color of Aurolith, the same shade Arian wore in the portrait at the end of the gallery. The crown of Aurolith rested on her head, a narrow gold band set with pale stones that caught candlelight without demanding it. She walked at an even pace, spine straight, chin level. The room rose, not in choreographed sequence, but in the instinctive, uneven way of people responding to something felt before it is decided. Zirel stood midway down the left side, stripped of position, present only by minor family entitlement. She rose because the room rose, and because not rising was not a thing that could be done. Thealora walked the full length of the room and stopped at its center, the exact point where she had once knelt on cold marble with a balanced tray, the exact point where red wine had soaked through to her skin. She looked at the room. A title does not make someone noble, character does. The silence held for one full breath. Then the applause came, not measured, not polite, but the kind a room produces when it has been waiting to release something without knowing it was waiting. Thalassa stepped forward carrying the ceremonial coronation crown. She climbed to where Thealora stood and placed it with the deliberateness of someone who had imagined the gesture for a long time. Her hands were steady, her eyes were not. She leaned close and spoke at Thealora's ear. "Welcome home, my granddaughter." Thealora closed her eyes. The girl who stirred barley soup in a stranger's house and believed she was born to serve, stood in the center of the kingdom that had always been hers, wearing its crown, and came home.